Clause 28 is about the nominated supplier. For full statement, you may refer to the PAM contract 2018. There are 8 subclauses here. The content is quite similar to the clause 27 regarding the nominated subcontractor. As these two are having similar nature, being nominated by the employer to carry out a specific task. Now let us look at this slide that simplifies the information in the PAM contract. We are in clause 28 regarding the nominated supplier. The nominated supplier is sometimes termed as the NS. The NS is basically a supplier providing the materials and goods. In return, the NS gets paid for the materials and goods supplied. And this supplier is nominated by the architect. It is under the instructions of the architect that the contractor will acquire the goods and materials from this supplier. This is unless it is reasonably objected by the contractor within 14 days of the nominations. The nominated supplier is similar to the nominated subcontractor. The relevant expenditure shall be categorized under the prime cost sum and also the provisional sum. It is typically under the prime cost sum. In the case that there are architect instructions, then it will be regarded as the provisional sum. We have discussed about the differences between the prime cost sum and the provisional sum when we talk about the nominated subcontractor in clause 27. For more details, you may refer to the relevant videos. Next, we talk about the obligations of the nominated supplier. Basically, the nominated supplier will need to supply the materials and goods as per the quality and standard stated in the contract and to the reasonable satisfactions of the architect. This is the obligations of a typical supplier. You will need to provide the materials up to the intended quality. Next, the nominated supplier will need to make good any defects of the materials and goods supplied which appear within the defect liability period and bear the relevant expenses. In another word, the nominated supplier is liable with the quality of the materials and goods. There is a period called defect liability period. This will be the period that any defects found on the materials and goods, the nominated supplier will have to make good and rectify without any charges to the contractors and the employer. This is under the typical conditions. There are some cases which is exceptional to this warranty to the goods and material supply. The circumstances are listed here. This is particularly when the defects are not ought to be examined before using. Of course, the best way to do it is to have the materials being checked and examined before using. But sometimes this doesn't happen. In the case that the materials has been used, when the defect is detected, now we need to make sure that the defects of the materials and goods is actually due to its own defect or due to the wear and tear after using. It could be due to the reason that the materials and goods are in good conditions before using. Now it has been used and defects occur as a result of improper handling or other issues. And in this case, the nominated supplier is not liable to those defects. Another case that the nominated supplier can be released from the warranty of the materials and goods is that the defects are solely due to the defective workmanship or any other activities by the contractor due to the negligence of the contractor. Under these circumstances, the defects of the materials and goods now is not really due to its poor quality. It is in fact due to the improper handling by the contractor or poor workmanship. In this case, the nominated supplier is not liable. Next, the nominated supplier will need to deliver the materials and goods based on the delivery program agreed with the contractor. The nominated supplier will need to supply the materials on time so that it doesn't interrupt or cause any delay to the work progress of the contractor. Next, the nominated supplier will need to pass the ownership of the materials and goods to the contractor upon delivery. This is regardless whether the payment has been made in full. In another word, when the materials and goods being delivered to the contractor, the ownership of these materials and goods should change hands from the nominated supplier to the contractor. Even the contractor still yet to make any payment, the ownership of the material should transfer. Next, regarding the payment. The payment to the nominated supplier will need to be done within 7 days after the period of honouring certificate. Of course, this is subjected to the retentions by the contractor. The retentions means a certain amount of the payment has been held back by the contractor, which is typically in 5% of the amount, to ensure the good quality and good conditions of the material supplied. And at the end of the defect liability period, the retention fund shall be fully released back to the nominated supplier. This clause is similar to those under clause 27 related to the nominated subcontractor, which payment should be made to the nominated supplier within 7 days after the period of honouring certificate. The contractor will need to wait for a maximum of 21 days to have the claim paid by the employer, and then within the next 7 days, the contractor will need to pay to the nominated supplier. Next is about the objections to the nominations of the supplier. You know that the nominated supplier is nominated by the employer or the architect, and theoretically the contractor will have to agree with that and work closely with this nominated supplier. Nevertheless, the contractor have the right to reject the appointment of the nominated supplier only when there is reasonable reasons for that. Now, when the contractor objects the appointment of this nominated supplier, the contractor will need to disclose facts and documented evidence to justify the objections. This may include the financial standing of the nominated supplier. Solvency means the bankruptcy of the nominated supplier, or the technical competency of the nominated supplier. The reasons for the objections needs to be reasonable for the architect to consider. Now, if the objections is reasonable, the architect will have to respond in either of these 3 ways. First, if the architect decided still to engage that nominated supplier, then the architect issue further instructions to remove the objections. That means the architect forced the contractor to accept this nominated supplier even though there was an objection by the contractor. Under these circumstances, by hook or by crook, the contractor will have to accept. Another possible response is the architect accepted the objections by the contractor. With that, the initially proposed nominated supplier will need to change person. As a result, the architect will nominate another nominated supplier to work with the contractor. The third possible response by the architect will be this one. It falls somewhere in between the first and the second option here, which the architect still intend to keep with this original nominated supplier, knowing the contractor is reluctant to work together with this nominated supplier. With that, the architect cancel the nominations and issue an instructions on meeting the relevant materials and goods under the responsibility of the contractor. That means the architect removed the nominated supplier from the coverage of the contractor, which the contractor is no longer responsible for the nominated supplier, together with the relevant materials and goods supplied by this nominated supplier. In this case, the contractor do not need to work with this nominated supplier, which at the same time, the nominated supplier still work with the project. Now it will be under the architect. Next, we talk about the value of the materials and goods supplied by the nominated supplier. This one is related to the payment. The relationship model now is similar to the nominated subcontractor. There is no direct relationship between the employer and the nominated supplier. The relationship will be between the employer and the contractor, and then another relationship is between the contractors and the nominated supplier. When come to the payment, the employer pay to the contractor and the contractor pay to the nominated supplier. So now when the materials and goods being supplied to the site, it has been taken over by the contractor as the ownership has been transferred from the nominated supplier to the contractor. At this juncture, basically the nominated supplier has supplied the goods and materials. Theoretically, the nominated supplier should be able to receive payment. But now the payments come from the employer. The payment will be paid from the employer to the contractor, and then the contractor will need to pay the relevant value to the nominated supplier. This entire process shall be recorded in a certificate, which is issued by the architect to the contractor. The total value of the materials and goods supplied by the nominated supplier is clearly stated there. So once this certificate is issued, the architect will need to inform the nominated supplier regarding the existence of this certificate. This informs the nominated supplier that he can go and claim for the value of the materials and goods supplied by him from the contractor. This is to ensure that the nominated supplier is not being exploited by the contractor, purposely retain the payment, resulting the nominated supplier not being paid for the material supplied. And then the contractor should retain about 5% of the sum as the retention fund. We mentioned that the retention fund here is meant to ensure the quality supplied by the nominated supplier is up to the standard. If the qualities of the materials is good, after the defect liability period, the retention fund shall be returned to the nominated supplier. Now, upon the architect certified to release the retention fund to the nominated supplier, then payment should be made to the nominated supplier within 7 days after the period of honouring certificate, and this retention fund should be paid in full. Once it is certified to be released to the nominated supplier, the contractor can no longer retain the money and will have to pay the nominated supplier in full. Next is about the payment to the nominated supplier. Similar to the payment to the nominated subcontractor, the payment should be done within 7 days after the period of honouring certificate. Typically, the period of honouring certificates is about 21 days. This duration is normally stated in the appendix of the contract, and the payment to the nominated subcontractor is subjected to the retentions by the contractor. Next, the contractor's liability for nominated suppliers. The contractor should be fully responsible for any negligence, omissions, default, and/or breach of contract by the nominated supplier. This is due to the relationship between the contractors and the nominated supplier. As there is no legal relationship between the employer and the nominated supplier, the only relationship between the employer and the nominated supplier is the employer nominated that supplier to supply the materials and goods. With that, the employer is not liable to the contractor regarding any negligence, omissions, defaults, or breach of contract by the nominated supplier. When the contractor delivers the works to the employer, the material supplied by this nominated supplier, it will be considered a part of the work to be delivered together by the contractor. Now, if the problem is due to the qualities of the goods and materials, the contractor will need to be liable to the employer. And in the case that the materials is not up to the spec, it will be up to the contractors to deal with the nominated supplier. The next clause here states that the employer has no privities of contract with the nominated supplier. That means the nominated supplier is under the responsibility of the contractor, and there is no legal responsibility or legal relationship between the employer and the nominated supplier. This mechanism is very similar to the nominated subcontractor.